Hello and welcome to Mont Marte TV. I'm really glad you've tuned in. It's great to see you. Today I'll be painting this here painting with a palette knife. And painting with a palette knife is a really different way to do it. And although you don't have the pinpoint precision of a brush, the resulting painting from a palette knife always comes out looking textural and a little bit impressionistic. So let's get into it. So I've transferred my image here and I've just lightly marked everything in. And then I can go back and finish them. Things like the hands and the faces here. The thing to remember is there is no point refining certain elements if they're not in the right place. You could draw a hand like Leonardo da Vinci, but if it's in the wrong place, it will still look wrong. This seems like a really complicated drawing, but if you transfer the grid system from the PDF printout, you can't go wrong. Another thing to remember is your drawing does not need to be detailed. We just need a guide as to where to lay the paint. And because we'll be applying the paint so thickly, we'll just need the basic shapes, so we can sculpt with our paint and palette knife. As I said, it's a very exciting, intuitive way to paint. Well, we've drawn that up. Now we can apply our paint. But before we can apply our paint with the palette knife, we need to lay an underpainting. And we can do that with phthalo blue. And we'll lay that down the bottom, and as we move up the canvas, we will lighten it with titanium white. We'll apply our paint with the number 16 filbert. Some of this will be covered, but the bits that show through will be interesting due to the broken surface. Now that our background underpainting is laid in, we can move on to the figures, and we're going to lay in the skin tones. And I'm going to use a flesh tint as the underbase for this. I'm using the colour just out of the tube as I'm not too concerned about it, as it is just an undercoat and will be overpainted. Once my skin tone is down, I squeeze out some lamp black. With this I paint in the hair and our male dancer's shirt. I have added a little bit of water to thin the black to suggest a lighter hue. Although this is not really required, it just reminds me of shape when it comes to blocking in my top coat. The last step in our undercoating is to lay in our dancer's dress, and we can do that in red. So let's get this red on and then we can start the next exciting step. I water down the acrylic, but this time so I can see the pencil marks. The filbert is the perfect brush for this, and that round tip is great for general purpose jobs like this. I lay the paint thicker in the folds, and while I have the red, I lay some colour into the lips and onto the flower she wears in her hair. This is starting to take shape nicely. Well, our underpainting is done, and it is now time to palette knife on our top coat, thereby changing this flat illustration into a painting. And when you apply pigment thickly with a palette knife, it tends to add a really rich, sumptuous vibrancy to the piece. And to apply our paint, the palette knife that I'm using is a number 4. And this is really important because it has the profile that we need with a fairly small tip. The colours that I'm going to be using are emerald green, lemon yellow and orange, and they're in the 250ml tubs, along with the other colours that you have. The other important thing to use is an easy clean palette, so you have a nice flat surface to scrape your palette knife onto. The colours are the artist's choice. The only thing to keep in mind is to keep the majority of the colours light up the top and darker down the bottom. This will give the painting a lightened focal point that will seem to flood the work with confetti-like abstract brilliance. Well, the background is done. You could probably keep going if you wanted to, but I'm fairly happy with that. The next step is to paint in the dress. And we're going to use permanent red. We're going to use a little bit of yellow for mixing and for the highlights. And we're going to darken our shadows with the phthalo blue. So let's get this red on. This is fairly intuitive in regards to colour application. When you lay it on thick, it is just like oil paint, as I said. When you bring two colours together, it looks nice if you don't over mix them, I reckon. For shadow areas, I mix in a little blue to my red and block it in like that. For the pleats or ruffles, I lay straight red onto one side, and onto the other side, I mix in some red mixed with a little yellow. I then roughly mix them with the palette knife. For shadows, I mix in more phthalo. Well, laying in that red dress was a lot of fun. The next thing we're going to do is to create the black on our male dancer. And in black is the type of colour where it is such a strong pigment. So you can see some of these greys. Instead of mixing white with black, I'm going to use some impasto medium. And I think that's a really great way to lighten dark without losing its intensity or tone. So let's lay some of this onto our palette. The impasto dries a little bit more opaque, so take this into account. So I quickly lay this into my light areas and then come back and lay in the black and roughly mix them together. Of course you could lay black in over the whole area if you like. It's really just the texture that this project is all about. But once you have the impasto gel, it triggers other creative ideas for you to use in the future. So now let's create our skin tone. And for this we use flesh tint again for the base. I squeeze out 4 spots of this, and to one I add an equal proportion of titanium white. And the other 3 I add some raw sienna. The first spot I add half as much of sienna. The next I add 2 parts of sienna to 1 part of flesh tint. And the last spot I add half as much again and adds the same amount of raw umber. With these tones I can start modelling the skin. I use the darkest tone for the shadow areas, moving up to the lightest tone for the highlight. I then use the other tones in between. I really love this way of suggesting skin. It has real body and an authentic look to it. You just add tone into it wet on wet until you are happy with the effect. I generally start dark and add light to that. Well, I think it's finished now. I've got to tell you, that was absolutely great. Thanks again for tuning in, and maybe next time you're creating an artwork, you might like to pull out your painting knife for something different. Well, if you're not there now, don't forget to have a look at our other art lessons, which you can find at montmarte.net. And while you're there, don't forget to like us on Facebook and check out our family feed and our blogs. So until next time, keep on painting.